Why don't we get started? Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, Organizing Around the Right to Counsel for Evictions, Information from the Field, Justifications and Questions to Ask. My name is John Pollock. I'm the coordinator of the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel, and I'll let Pablo introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Excited to share organizing lessons around our Right to Counsel campaign in New York City. I'm currently the director of CASA in the Bronx and also a member of the Right to Counsel New York City Steering Committee. And as we get started for today, here are our goals that we've outlined for today's webinar. This is the first series in the series of 5 that we'll be doing over the next month and a half. We're excited to have you all be here today with us. And here are some of the goals we've outlined today. We're looking forward to building excitement about Right to Counsel and launching a nationwide movement around Right to Counsel. It's so exciting to see the recent victories in Baltimore and Boulder and seeing statewide campaigns being launched, and we'll cover some more of that today. And in a reminder, anything is possible in organizing. Right to Counsel is achievable and necessary. We'll also give you all a general overview of things to think about when planning a Right to Counsel campaign. What does it look like for your on the ground work? How to, prioritize building a strong coalition, because it's not just about winning the Right to Counsel, but then there's the implementation and just overall arching goals of building tenant power. And then this first webinar will also serve as a prep meeting to cover some of the organizing perspective and lawyering perspective about Right to Counsel before we move over the coming weeks into jurisdiction-specific webinar. And before we begin, a couple logistical items to get through. This session is being recorded and it will be available for you all. And to the person's question, Carol, the slides will be made available after the session. We'll make sure we share this slide deck. We want to be here and share our knowledge with you. And we will have a question and answers portion, so please feel free to drop in the Q&A feature to ask us questions.
So I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about where the Right to Counsel movement currently is. The where we were is a reference to prior to COVID-19. The movement was really gearing up, as some of these news stories showed. We love this headline, is Right to Counsel on its way to becoming a standard practice. Even now, where we are has not changed things. The momentum is still there. You're gonna see just exactly how much is happening right now, but we're really excited to say that COVID, while making the eviction crisis much, much worse, has not dampened the enthusiasm for Right to Counsel. It has only increased it. And so we're really excited to share some of that with you today. Where we are right now is we have 7 jurisdictions that have already enacted a Right to Counsel, and then we have a number that are pending. And what's really exciting this year is all the states that have legislation pending. You can see there are 7 of them that are already there, a couple that we're expecting, and a couple of cities also that are on the radar. So there's just a tremendous amount of enthusiasm right now from a lot of different quarters. We don't have time to go through the different provisions of these bills or the enacted laws. This is why I just put it on the slide so you can see later. For purposes of today, just know that they all have different parameters in terms of their scope. They may have different, some of them have some unique funding mechanisms. How long they take to roll out is different. And how they got there, whether it was by ballot initiative or city ordinance, has been variable. So that's information you can see on our website as well as on the slides after this call. And just a really increasingly growing list of places working on the Right to Counsel. And what excites us is that this list, when we, people expect, maybe expect New York or maybe expect Los Angeles, but, when you see La Crosse, Wisconsin and Omaha and, Toledo, that really shows that this movement is taking root across the country, rural areas, urban areas, Midwest, West, you name it. It's just really picking up steam tremendously. So I'm going to turn it back to Pablo, who's going to talk a little bit about why it is that we do this all.
So hi again, everyone. So one of the reasons to really build and launch a Right to Counsel campaign is it addresses several goals and values. It's about tenant empowerment, right? Addressing widespread imbalance of power. So I want to share a little bit with y'all about developing the Right to Counsel in New York City campaign. It first started in 2013 with our organization, CASA, Community Action for Apartments. We're in the Southwest Bronx, and we do tenant organizing work in the community. So we approached our members back then. I wasn't a part of staff, to be transparent. This was back in 2013, and we were talking to our members the issues that are, impacting tenants in the Bronx. Folks had several concerns around increases, around safety and security. And then one common theme that really binded all of our members' experiences was housing court, right? Our members were in housing court, had an active eviction case, or knew someone in their family that had been evicted or was experiencing homelessness. And so what we did to launch a campaign was we spent a year with our members going over different organizing units. And that's what I wanted to share a little bit with you all today about why I feel that in Right to Counsel in New York City, we were successful, is that this move came from the tenants. It was the issue that they identified. It was one of their goals. We want to stop evictions. We want to address the imbalance of power that landlords wield over tenants in Bronx housing court. And to me, the process of organizing really matters, right? How you build a campaign. To me, it's not just about passing Right to Counsel, but it's about the process that we went through to build the leadership of tenants, to build a strong coalition where everyone is unified in their message. And then once the law passes, there's a whole implementation phase, right? And we know Right to Counsel as a stepping stone towards organizing towards a world where there is no evictions. But that's a long-term goal, right? Right now in the pandemic, we're having those conversations nationally, right? About eviction moratoriums, about Right to Counsel. And then fundamentally, what we're talking about is housing as a human right. We're not there yet, but we're organizing to get there. And some other things to kind of address around the impact of evictions. In the Bronx, 2,000 people were going into housing court every day to fight to stay in their homes. And as y'all know, like in the Bronx, who is being evicted, who is being taken to court? The majority of our members are Black and brown folks, so there is that impact of evictions. To us, Right to Counsel is about racial justice, it's about economic justice, it's about gender justice. And as we all know, that there are devastating long-term consequences when people are evicted. Next slide. So I just covered a little bit about the impact of evictions on race, gender, about economic justice, and there is a whole component about who is impacted by evictions, right? So in this slide, you'll see that Black women renters were filed for eviction at double the rate of white renters, or higher in 17 out of 36 states. That's also true in the Bronx, right? Those are the folks who are being impacted most by evictions. Next slide. And that is just only exacerbated by COVID, right? When people don't have, right now, the crisis has really grown and been exploded and is out there in the national conversation, right? Right now across the country, a lot of renters are struggling with paying rent, have lost employment, are very concerned about their ability to pay rent next month. And even though in New York, we have one of the strongest eviction protections that was passed at the end of the year, where tenants, where the majority of tenants cannot be evicted until May 1st. If they submit a hardship declaration form with the state, with their landlord or the court system, we know that one thing isn't being addressed, right? And that's the need for clearing rent and canceling rent. So even with this eviction protections, there's still the whole underlying issue of that folks are owing rents and that rent keeps piling up. And we also have to address that, right? Because a part of evictions is also about, for landlords, right? They're in the majority of landlords are in the business to make money. And that takes a strong, that enables landlords to wield their power over tenants and housing courts and in evictions. Next slide. So as y'all know, there are many consequences to evictions. It has an impact on homelessness, on mental health, kids' education, employment opportunities, there's the health effects, the mental toll that it takes on people. And that was the point I wanted to illustrate earlier around having eviction protections or moratoriums in place are great, but it does continue to have a toll on people's worrying about the future, anxiety, mental health issues. And then it is about, evictions are also about, to me, in the context of the Bronx, another connection is gentrification, right? Who gets evicted, who gets displaced from the Bronx, because the Bronx has some of the most rent regulated housing stock, but it's also where our community members experience the most rent burdens, right? Meaning that half the people that live in the Bronx are paying more than 1/3 of their income towards rent, which by the government's definition is that it's not affordable rent. So essentially people in the Bronx are at the highest risk of eviction and already have the highest rates of being able to not afford their apartments in the first place. And so I think what I wanted to share, going back to our campaign and developing a campaign, is there are different critical components to think of when you're launching a right to counsel campaign, right? So I kind of shared with y'all, we surveyed our members, we trained our members to do court observations. We went into housing court in the Bronx and observed the behavior of judges. We observed the behavior of landlord attorneys and the disparity in the treatment of tenants by judges versus how they treated landlord attorneys. And again, that's about power, right? When tenants go to Bronx housing court, it is a disempowering experience. It is hard to navigate if your primary language isn't English. There aren't really any resources there for you or people that can help you understand where to go or where your court case is being held. And there's almost 20 different courtrooms where solely evictions are being held. So those are, that disparity in who has power in housing court is why we also launched the Right to Counsel campaign. And so we did a year of observations. Our members talked to people in housing court, and we put out a report called Tipping the Scales. And that was really impactful in terms of getting more growing awareness about what was happening in courts and the disparity of power. And that led to 2014, the Right to Counsel New York City Coalition was formed. And the Right to Counsel New York City Coalition is still active today, fighting for an eviction-free New York. It's a diverse coalition made up of tenant leaders, organizers, legal service providers, as well as other housing advocates. And it's something that we, that was important to the success of the campaign and really critical was that, we engage into different organizing strategies. And those are some of the learnings I wanted to share with you all, right? In having a successful grassroots-led campaign, there's different core campaign components that you can't really ignore, right? There's the base building, right? You always bring more people into the movement, into the coalition. And so we're actively doing outreach. We were in front of housing court, talking to people who were going in, who were coming out, to recruit them into the organization and the coalition. So you can never give up on base building. You always have to do base building. And understand that right now we're all in the same boat where because of the pandemic, we don't have our traditional outreach ways or methods that are effective. But I encourage y'all, if you're able to and safely to do so, it's important to go where people are most directly impacted, often housing courts, or if there's landlords that you can identify in your communities that are known bad actors, right? Because there's a connection between landlords. We see in the Bronx the landlords that don't make repairs, don't give services, harass tenants, take them to court, start more eviction cases, are all the same landlords who are trying to exploit the system and profit from evictions. The other thing about core campaign components is I covered base building. There's coalition building, right? So we established the Right to Counsel coalition. It's made up of diverse populations, but we created a deliberate structure to empower tenant leaders to lead the campaign, right? And to me, in organizing, the principle is we are creating a space for tenant leaders to really lead the campaign and make decisions. So not context, not everyone, to me, not everyone should have the same power in a coalition, right? We want to prioritize those who are most marginalized, who traditionally don't have power or access, and put them in the driving seat. So I'll share with y'all a link to the Right to Counsel in New York City Coalition Toolkit that you can visit and learn more about our campaign and the different strategies. But those, I think, are two things that were super critical to the success, right? How we brought members in, trained them on housing court, and got them to see right to counsel is a game changer. It will shift the balance of power. And to me, that really, for our tenant leaders, that built a lot of ownership over the campaign, right? Because when we started back in 2013, we had skeptics out there. We had some attorneys that were like, we've been doing this work for decades. And we haven't been successful. How are you all going to be successful when we haven't been? And I think the key answer to that is in power, there is numbers, right? When people come together, identify a problem and build a campaign in which they truly feel the ownership of, it matters. So again, to me, organizing process matters. And I think the second lesson that we really learned was coalition building, right? We need to bring in all the stakeholders. And so we put tenant leaders in the decision-making seat. We worked to identify movement lawyers who would support right counsel, and also begin to think of, right, we're essentially overnight, we're creating a whole new system that didn't exist. In New York City, we went from 200 tenant attorneys back in 2012 to almost a little over 600 today. So you're creating a whole system, a whole infrastructure when you're passing right to counsel that hasn't been created, or maybe the court systems haven't thought of. And so we did create space within the coalition for a legal working group in which we had movement lawyers begin to think about how do people access right to counsel? How do I learn the best of eviction defenses for people to make sure that they're in their homes? And then there is this whole other battle in coalition building is we built a lot of allies in the faith community, with unions, with other tenant organizations, with legal service providers. We virtually had no opposition. The one opposition that we really had was the city and the budget. They said, it's great that y'all have support, that you have a veto-proof majority in the city council that support this bill. But the city and the mayor's concern was the cost of right to counsel, right? And so it is important. One thing that really changed the campaign for us was working with Stout, who helped us produce a report that demonstrated that, in fact, if New York City enacted the right to counsel, they would save up to $320 million. And that to us was like one of those defining moments where it changed the course of the campaign, and it made it even harder for the mayor to not pass right to counsel. And here on this slide, you'll see the national eviction cost projection and what that means on different government services. Next. And then with the moratoriums that have recently been enacted during the pandemic, as you all know, if people are evicted, they're at more risk of being infected. So right now, evictions are a public health issue, right? So it is important that people have housing stability that helps protect the public health. It's important that homeless folks have shelter. That was a really big fight in New York City for homeless advocates to ensure that homeless folks had somewhere to shelter. And yeah, and we know that when folks don't have homes, it's further exacerbated. So as far as you'll see here on the slide that there's in addition to being evicted and being homeless and causing a bigger spread of COVID, that also means that more folks will unfortunately, there's a higher mortality rate and pass away. So it's a no-brainer, right? Like we need the whole country should have a universal eviction moratorium right now. And with that, those lessons from our campaign and some of the justifications, I'll hand it over to John, who will walk us more through the effectiveness, cost savings, and complexity.
Thank you. So the numbers for right to counsel really have spoken for themselves. In New York and Pablo's organization and what they've caused to happen with 86% of tenants remaining in their homes, the eviction rate, the eviction dropping 41%, the filings dropping by 30%. And that really for us is such a critical statistic, because when you have systemic representation, when landlords know that people are represented every single time if they want counsel, that really changes the calculus of what landlords engage in when they think of how to behave, not just in terms of filing an eviction, but in general, whether they're going to make repairs, whether they're going to be reasonable in negotiating any problems, and so on and so forth. So it really has the ability, in a way that just ramping up representation in some degree does not, of changing the entire nature of the relationship and changing the usage of the housing court. And of course, default judgments go down. That's, another huge problem in the housing court is that the default rate is over 50% in almost every jurisdiction. And that is, given the consequences we just talked about, it's basically completely unsupportable to leave a situation where that many people are not involved in the proceeding because they've determined and worked out either that it doesn't work for them, the proceeding is hopeless the way it currently works, or that they can't participate because of access issues. Also really important is that judges who have sometimes said, we don't want lawyers in housing court because we're worried about efficiency. They've actually said in New York City, it's actually increased efficiency from their standpoint. It has not made their jobs impossible. And San Francisco, similarly, the filing rate decreased in just 1 year by 10%. 2/3 of tenants receiving counsel full scope representation were able to stay in their home. And what's interesting too is in San Francisco, there's no income limit on the right to counsel, and yet almost everyone that taps into it is actually low income. I don't actually have the data up here from Cleveland, but it just got released, and they have, I think it's somewhere close to 90% of the tenants who are avoiding displacement, disruptive displacement as a result of the first 6 months of the right to counsel. So they've had another city where the right is already in place is doing incredibly well. These are places where there have been statistics produced prior to actual passage of a right to counsel, but you can see that tenants are more likely to stay in their home. They pay less money to their landlords. On average, the rent judgments are actually extremely important. And especially in Hennepin County, finding that they're 4 times less likely to use a homeless shelter. That's something that has real cost implications. This is just one of the stout reports that Pablo mentioned, the most recent one from Baltimore that showed that a $5.7 million investment would yield $35 million in savings to the city and the state. So just an incredible multiplier of a right to counsel. And there have been, as these other stout reports done, that have basically shown the same kinds of multipliers in New York City and Philadelphia and Los Angeles. The other thing when we talked about justifications, besides this sort of cost benefit and the impact of counsel, is that we have really different legal issues in place right now. The moratoria that exist at the federal, state, and local level are constantly changing. They are very difficult for tenants to figure out which of those apply to them and what each of them actually says. The moratoria are complex in terms of what they cover. Often those things change as they get renewed or expire or get put back in place. The CDC moratorium in particular has a very complicated declaration requirement that tenants have to fill out under penalty of perjury. And then there are significant due process problems with both in-person and remote hearings. The in-person proceedings are a tremendous danger for all the reasons we just outlined. And the remote hearings, the Zoom hearings, have been just a disaster in many jurisdictions because the tenants either don't have don't have access, they don't have broadband, they don't have a smartphone, or they don't know how to use it, or they're actually able to get on and they don't know how to do things like even introduce evidence. They have no idea how to use the technology to put on their case. So that those Zoom hearings, which were rolled out very fast without much real process, are actually in some cases making things worse and really speak to the fact that the courts need to be closed. As Pablo was saying, they should not be open right now. But if they're going to, because some of them are going to be open whether we want them to or not, the right to counsel is so critical in dealing with these kinds of problems. It's also critical for obtaining rental assistance. And ensuring that the rental assistance is not illegally refused by the landlord, which in some jurisdictions they have an obligation to take it, and ensuring that the court does not try to evict the tenant while the tenant is in the process of trying to get rental assistance. So basically what we've given you so far is the justifications for right to counsel and sort of where we are with the movement. Where we want to shift gears now and talk to you is at the 30,000 foot level, which is what are the kinds of things, what are the kinds of questions that you're going to be facing when you start to put this together. We are not going to answer those questions in this session. This session is just to lay out what those questions are. The subsequent sessions where we feature Cleveland and we feature New York City and the other places, they're going to answer some of these questions as it related to their jurisdiction. So we're not going to be able to get into all the weeds today. If you do have a question about a specific one of these, you can feel free to put it in the Q&A and we'll try to get to it if we can. So Pablo, I believe this is you.
Hi again, everyone. So these are some of the questions that, as John said, we're not going to necessarily get into the weeds today, but it is important. I would share around what our experience in New York City is our members did want to ensure that it was a right, and it wasn't something that was going to be temporary, a pilot, because we know that pilots can go away with funding. And so our members' vision in New York City was really, we want this to be, in terms of establishing a right, it's important that it's not something that you fight for year after year in the budget that changes with a different mayor or administration or council members. So that's important considerations, right? What does a right actually look like for tenants and how do they access that? Next.
And just one thing I'll add before we move on too is that the bills that have passed so far, the ordinance that passed so far, generally do not actually use the words right to counsel. And that's the reasons why not are complex. They have something to do with resistance from the jurisdictions in some cases, and in some cases have to do with liability issue questions that the city raises about that and other factors. So again, there are a lot of weeds we can get into on that that we don't have time to get into today, but it's worth noting that the right concept, which is why we're all here today, can be very difficult to get the word right in the bill, even if you're actually providing what is a right, but it's not worded as such.
That's a good point, John. It took us a couple years to get the city to publicly call it right to counsel, and we're in that moment now. So it did take a lot of organizing work. So there's different ways that right to counsel can be achieved, right? Depending on whether you're a city, locality, state. So here's some of the different ways: the state statute, city ordinance, a city ballot initiative, court rule. Unlikely. Has that happened? From my own knowledge.
It actually has not happened on housing, but it has
Okay.
happened in some other rights to counsel that have been done by court rule where there was no statute and no court decision. It was just done by the courts using its own administrative authority.
Cool. And then there's always litigation.
Which we are, and I will just add from our perspective, we're very, very, very cautious on litigation because there has not been a right to counsel housing case for about 30 years. And there's very, very, very little litigation on that subject. So any case there is going to have a major impact.
That's great. I think that further emphasizes the importance of organizing and people power. So there's also in consideration, I talked a little bit about it before, but early on in the process, I think it's critical before you launch a campaign to begin identifying and seeing who are the stakeholders you're going to work with, right? Who are the legal service providers in your community that are potentially already doing pro bono eviction defense work or get some funding to do eviction defense work. And I talked about like whose voices are we prioritizing at the table. So I think something that was important in building the Right to Counsel New York City Coalition was establishing different working groups in which different stakeholders had agency and had ownership. So I mentioned, we empowered tenant leaders. We created an organizing working group for the tenant leaders to make critical decisions on the campaign, right? About what does the legislation look like? What does the right look like? Who are we targeting? What are the direct actions we're doing? One of the things that we did a lot in Right to Counsel was some of the tactics were tenant leaders would have a lot of lobby meetings with their city council members to get them to sign on and sponsor the legislation. There was a lot of public education we had to do. So tenant leaders took on the role of planning town halls in the 5 different boroughs and leading them to bring stakeholders together to talk about right to counsel. There was also a lot of advocacy efforts with community boards, which in New York City, there's people from the community who sit on a community board. And while they aren't the elected official, they do have influence. So we were able to garner a lot of support citywide from community boards about the need for right to counsel. So endorsing the campaign, and then there's the different players in the campaign, right? Where it's important to do. I think another thing that we did was really do a power analysis, right? In New York, the housing court system is run by the state agency, the Office of Court Administration. So it's important for us to figure out who are the key players in OCA. And I think another critical thing that we did was there was a retired judge that we got their support for them to come out publicly and right to counsel. And I think that was big for them as part of OCA, right? In their former role to come out and support right to counsel. There's tenant unions, the organizers, and then really in New York City, there's a nonprofit legal service provider community, Primary Legal Services Corporation, which y'all might be familiar with across the country, and Legal Aid Society are the two biggest. So it's important to think about how do you engage, mobilize stakeholders, and what are their roles within the coalition? What kind of decision-making power do they have? And so these are other questions that we'll be addressing in future webinars, like what happens if tenants and organizers don't see this as a priority? That's a conflict. Who gets to make decisions in the bill drafting? That answer is very easy for me, tenant leaders. Are there any opponents other than the landlords? Depends on where you're at, right? And then, yeah, what do the courts feel about it? If right to counsel passes, they have this key role in making it empowering experience for tenants to access right to counsel, or they can make it really difficult for people to know about right to counsel. And those are some of, if I'm being honest, challenges we faced in New York City, right? Once it got implemented, how was the city doing outreach? How was the court letting people know that they had the right to, that they potentially had the right to an attorney? Next.
Yeah, and I'll just add one note about the courts. It's distressing that the courts are so, in many jurisdictions, unsupportive of reform. It may be unsurprising, and isn't unsurprising to those people who have worked often in housing courts to hear that. But the courts, if you can find a way to get the courts to come around on the issue, it's so tremendous, because trying to implement a right to counsel without their involvement it's difficult. Not impossible. It can be done around them in some ways, but it does really create some big hurdles if they are just really not wanting to participate or even sort of blockade the effort. So I just wanted to highlight that in particular. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislation itself. The legislations that the bills that have passed so far have kind of each learned from the prior ones and addressed additional things. And there are a lot of questions that come up in drafting, and some of which actually wind up sort of spilling into other things that we're going to talk about today, including the stakeholders and what people feel about these different things. But some of the things that you will have to address: what proceedings are included. Evictions, of course, are included. That's why we're here. But the question is, does it go any further than evictions? Do you address tenants who have repair issues? Do you address termination of subsidy proceedings? And what about appeals? Does every tenant who wants to appeal get to appeal? And how do you decide? That again goes back to what Pablo was saying. There's a decision maker process that has to happen that makes decisions around these things. And then there's also a pushback that you'll get from lawmakers who will say that goes too far. We cannot provide a right to counsel that does as much as you're saying it will do. So that winds up becoming an organizing point, a negotiation point, and other things. Do you have income limits? Do you have other eligibility requirements? Just to give an example, in Cleveland, the right to counsel is only for tenants that have children. It does not apply if you do not have children. That was a compromise that was worked out because the city was not willing to go further at the time. And it was sort of at one point looking like there would not be anything if that compromise was not reached. So sometimes those things are necessary. It really does speak to the power of organizing, because where there is strong organizing, there's much better capacity to push back against the city making unreasonable sort of limitations on the law. The phase-in process is very complicated and is going to really vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but how long do you need to get to roll it out? The prioritization of neighborhoods can be a very big political question. If you do it that way, if it's by zip code or so on, but how you do that, making those decisions and who makes those decisions is very important. We talked about it before. Does the bill actually use the words right to counsel? If it does, what is the city going to say? What is the legal department going to say? So on and so forth. The timing of appointment, when exactly is counsel appointed in the process? And is it appointment? In a lot of the jurisdictions, it's not actually appointed counsel. It's a sort of system where the attorneys are connected to tenants, but not through an appointment by the court. So how the mechanism of how that works is going to vary by jurisdiction. The outreach and organizing and mobilizing, I think that, Pablo has covered that. Getting funding for that included in the bill is tremendous if you can get that. The service providers, who gets to provide the legal services? Is it only nonprofits? Does pro bono have a role? These are all questions that are going to be decided by jurisdictions. I'll just say one quick thing about that, which is that when you're talking about a statewide right to counsel, sometimes the legal aid programs themselves will say we aren't able to cover all the areas in the state. So you may not, if you limit it to nonprofits, it might actually create a coverage problem. So that has to be worked out, with the ecosystem of providers to figure out what's viable. The reporting requirements are obviously very important to ensure that the right is being done, that it's reaching people, that people are getting their counsel, that the results are what we want. And then heading off the legal issues, this has come up in a number of cities. Some of that has to do with the right, whether you use the words right to counsel, and some of it just is, there are, if you're doing a city level right to counsel, there are, issues between whether the city has the power at all to do that, whether the state has some law that prohibits the city from doing that. And there are other legal questions that can come up in other jurisdictions. So getting that sort of addressed early is really important, and as you're starting to think about, what this is going to look like. And then data, data is we like to tell people, do not assume that you need to have rich data before you go forward with a campaign. It certainly helps, but there are jurisdictions that have gone forward with their campaigns without really any local data, other than the data you really have to have, which is how many evictions are there, and how many, if you have an income cap, like how many people are eligible. Like you have to be able to give a cost estimate. So you need some amount of data to do that, if nothing else. But we're really encouraging people to try to look to the data that's already been gathered in other jurisdictions. There's quite a bit. We don't want to have to reinvent the wheel in every single jurisdiction. So that's one of the questions, is to what degree can you use what's already out there? The courts and getting data from them, understanding what you're going to need, how cooperative they're going to be, what they already have, what they don't actually have because they don't even collect it. These are the questions that you have to start to get on the table early in your analysis process. And if you are going to do a study or a pilot, determining what that relationship is going to look like between whoever is conducting the pilot, overseeing it and studying it and doing the research, and who's providing the services, and organizers and anyone else that's involved in that process. What is that going to look like? Data, when you do your own data collection, in the sense of getting new data, how those results come out and how they are publicized and how they are described, there are a lot of political considerations that go into that. And so again, we're not going to go into that necessarily today, but I just wanted to flag that data is, it has been a really important part of the process, but do not assume that you have to have more than you actually need. We wanted to save enough time for questions, and there have been quite a number in the chat. And I wanted to just flag a few resources for you before we start answering questions. These are some things that we have on our website, which on our civil right to counsel website. These are basically ways that you can see where activity, this is a view of the map that shows what activity is currently available. This is a list of all of the bills, which is also on our website. This covers more than just evictions. There are bills about other things here too as well, but all the right to counsel bills are tracked on our website. And if you want to know what right to counsel already exists on the books, you can do that. You can choose the subject area, and then you can pick a particular state if that's what you're interested in. We also have a bibliography of all of the writing that's been done about the right to counsel, the law review articles, the studies, the media, et cetera. If you want to dig into that, as part of starting your process of exploring this in your jurisdiction. We also wanted to mention that this is just the first of 5 webinars. The purpose of this webinar, again, is really to lay the framework for what kinds of questions jurisdictions have to answer, so that when we go into these specific jurisdictional sessions, the people presenting those don't have to provide all of those questions that they had to answer first. They can just assume that people have heard that. We're going to make this webinar available to everyone to watch before they come to the subsequent session, so that they can really dive in and start to answer those questions to the best of their ability, and have time for people to answer questions. And in the summer, we actually are going to be having a convening We don't know what it's going to look like yet, but the point is for these webinars to lead to a working session where people who are working on right to counsel can get together, most likely virtually, start to share information about what they're doing in their jurisdiction, what kinds of questions are coming up and how they've answered them, and give people a chance to connect and see who's out there. There are so many of you right now that are working on this around the country, and it's really exciting to see all the energy. And you know, one of the things that I almost always do first off when people contact me is I say, oh, you know, your jurisdiction's asking the same questions as this one. Let me connect you to them. And so bridging those connections and getting to hear from people who are maybe further in the process than you, that's such a huge part of this process. Both Pablo and I are available to answer questions after this webinar, but we wanted to give time to answer some right now live. And so Maria, if you have a question lined up for us, we would love to start answering some.
John, can you take a look at Stephen Poland's question right at the beginning in the Q&A? So there's kind of, it's a larger question, I think, and I think both you and Pablo could tackle that.
To what degree do we see being bold and demanding on the need to spend on right to counsel to be part of the bigger horizon? In Connecticut, it's is it wrong to see it? Is it wrong to see the fight for right to counsel as a challenge to the paradigm of focusing on the budget? And yeah, I think this is a great question for Pablo, actually, because this is a big organizing question.
I'm just finishing reading it. I mean, yeah, I would say there's different layers to this question. One about, like, to me, it's this right to counsel is about movement building too, right? That's always been the goal of not only just passing right to counsel, but also building for us in New York City, the citywide and tenant now statewide movement that we help lay the groundwork for that, and to bring other folks. I think it is important to, part of organizing and, you know, winning campaigns is also about changing the material conditions and what people are experiencing in their lives. So that's so I think we're in a moment where we have to be as bold as we can. And I think that we're across the country. I see us doing that as a tenant movement, right? Around the fighting for universal eviction moratoriums, fighting to cancel rents, fighting to ensure that people are able to stay and really shifting the conversation around housing as a human right. And then, yeah, I mean, there's always a lot of our organizing campaigns tend to center around, like, legislative right advocacy. Like, if we pass right to counsel, what does that mean in terms of money? So I also see the connection between our organizing campaigns and we're always running into the question of money sometimes, right? With enacting right to counsel, what does that cost the city? It's really like an upfront, what's it called? It's an upfront investment, right? The $320 million that we projected happens as right to counsel is scaled up, right? It's an investment in communities and making sure that people are housed. And then, yeah, I'll let John chime in here if you have additional thoughts.
No, I mean, the only thing I would add is that, you know, the New York City Coalition was bold in its activity. You know, there was skepticism, I think, from a number of quarters, some of which was budget related, you know, that the city would just not be able to spend this much money. You know, the right to counsel costs, I think it's, you know, I think the city's currently budgeting 130 million and it's not done yet. So it did require boldness. And I think that New York is proof that boldness can succeed, you know, with good organizing. There was a question, there were a couple of questions I noted at the end. One is the fiscal cost of a right to counsel. It's so broad. You know, we've seen the cost range from anywhere from, you know, literally in some small places, it may be around $1 million or less. In some places, actually a fair bit less than $1 million. And then you have all the way up to New York, which is projected to be between 150 and 200 million. And so it is really hard to say there's some kind of average. Like, it just, you know, like in LA, you know, the number runs although their plan is comprehensive and includes more than just direct representation. It was budgeted around, I think, 70 or 80 million. In San Francisco, the original budget, I think, was around 6 or 7, but they're at 10 now because they discovered it's actually gone up because they're finding they need more than they originally expected. To a large degree, that's going to depend on the cost of living in the place, because that affects how much it costs to hire attorneys. To some degree, it also actually, and this relates to another question that someone else asked, which is the question about the kind of laws and how this contributes to the impacts of right to counsel. Where the landlord-tenant law is really strong, the tenant attorneys are going to have more to do. And therefore the cases are going to often take more time. The attorneys will spend longer on them because there's a lot more for them to do than just sort of negotiate a settlement. So where the law is strong, you'll see the cost often be higher of the cost of a right to counsel. And that's one of the reasons why the substantive law often is being addressed as we see these right to counsel campaigns. They're often not alone. They're often being paired with just cause eviction reform or landlord licensing or rent control or whatever, because there is that improvement that you see to right to counsel when you have stronger landlord-tenant laws in the first place. So that we do not yet have a map of what those are, but I can tell you that the American Bar Association was charged by Congress with studying the eviction laws across all 50 states. And they're actually in the process of putting together something that will be, to my knowledge, the first sort of mass production of such a study. And that will be really helpful to see what the national picture looks like, and that will help answer those questions about, the relationship between right to counsel and the law.
I also just wanted to add that cost isn't just, when we talk about cost, it's not just about money, is that there is a tangible cost to humans, right? And communities when people are evicted and face this kind of violence that we actually normalize in our society. And I mean, this pandemic is kind of, I think, is a wake-up call for all of us in terms of the human cost, right? We're willing to sacrifice 500,000 of our brothers and sisters just so the economy can keep going. So when we talk about costs, let's not forget that we are organizing and fighting for the humanity of people. And that is like a great political education work to do with your community members. And so I'm going to plug in the toolkit again. If you all want to check out and hear for more of an organizing perspective, and in here there's a bunch of great materials, including flyers, including a cost savings report, including agendas on the meetings we ran. If you go to, and we'll make sure we send this out too with the follow-up email, but you can access the toolkit at rtctoolkit.org.
And I just put that in the chat as well. I also, I pulled a little bit of a surprise on Pablo today because apparently I loaded the wrong slide deck that was missing a few of his slides. So I apologize for that. I don't know quite how I managed to do that. But the slide deck that goes out with the, after this session will include some of the things that he was covering during his remarks that have those points as well. There was a question about what are the most common types of outcomes in these cases. What we have seen so far is that, and again, I think these are great questions to ask the jurisdictions that are coming in the future, because they are the ones who can report on what they're seeing. We're going to have a session specifically on New York. We'll have one on San Fran and Cleveland. These are all places where the right to counsel is already in place. In general, what we've heard is that settlements are still the vast majority of what happens. The difference is that the settlements are vastly different than what comes out when tenants are unrepresented. The need to litigate, it's not causing a massive spike in litigation where suddenly there are trials being set on 50% of the cases or anything like that. That's generally not what's happening. And the reason why that's not happening is that the attorneys, even where there are legal claims they need to make, just filing the motions and showing the landlord, hey, this is my hand, this is what I have, that often is all that's necessary in order to make that negotiation happen. It doesn't require actually going to court and having a full hearing on the eviction case itself. So it is really settlements. Where they have gone to litigation, we have definitely seen judgments in tenants' favors far more frequently, although I don't know that we have the breakdown on judgments versus settlements in terms of the outcomes for tenants. I don't know, Pablo, if you've seen that specific breakout in New York City or not. Yeah, I don't think we have it. I think the city doesn't report it that in that specific a fashion. It's a great question. Um, but and the settlement terms are much more, they can be much more nuanced when an attorney is involved in figuring out things that work for the tenant. And that can, again, the most important thing is to preserve housing stability. That's not necessarily always going to mean in every case that they stay in their unit. And in some cases, the tenant may not want to stay in their unit. That may not be their goal. The goal of the attorney is to preserve stability. That may mean transitioning and doing it in a way that's not going to permanently damage the tenant's ability to secure for future housing. That may mean screening the eviction record so that it's not publicly available. That may be reducing the rent judgment. That may be, that could be even sort of outside of the courtroom, helping the tenant obtain, relocation assistance or whatever else they might need in order to transition. But that's the right to counsel is about getting tenants what they need based on what they want. That's ultimately the goal, is to get the clients what they want. And that's, that's the whole basis of the model.
John, if I can add, I think there's also the big picture things that we've seen that I would just wanted to emphasize that John covered pretty quickly is for folks who have, we're in year 3 of right to counsel, and the percentage have gone up. So 86% of tenants that had right to counsel in New York City, as John said, were able to stay in their homes. Their outcomes are drastically different. And often terms like with our community members, there's offenses that they can raise that aren't, that they might not be aware of, and including not getting repairs, not getting services, being harassed, like improper service. And then, something that the data doesn't capture are the threat and fear of eviction for people is really powerful, right? So we're doing a lot of tenant education constantly around what is the difference between a 14-day rent-a-man letter that feels really scary and intimidating to tenants when they first receive this notice that says, you owe X amount of money for this many months. If you don't pay by the end of the month, you have to vacate the premises, even though that's not an actual eviction order. So some people experience that differently, right? They feel really threatened, or if English isn't your primary language or you're undocumented, you might choose to voluntarily self-evict. And so that's an important part of right to counsel is the outreach work and the continuous education of tenants. And, the encouraging thing that I think proved us right is in the last 2 years, eviction cases have gone down. So there are less cases being filed in eviction. And oftentimes, one of the most common things we hear when we sit down with tenants who are being taken to court, they're often say like, what, my landlord's not even keeping accurate bookkeeping records. Or we've seen members come in who get sued, go to court, fight their case alone, sign a stipulation, and it turns out, they didn't owe the money. We'll sometimes see that same tenant back in court 3 months with the same rent that the landlord claims. So I think that's also the powerful part about right to counsel is people's experience with an attorney is a lot different, right? And then landlords can't start frivolous lawsuits.
So there's a really excellent question that someone asks about, have we seen pushback from the courts based on the fact that they take a piece of the eviction filing fees? That's a great question. In other words, yes, the courts do have a conflict of interest in this, that they want, in some cases, more in where they are taking a part of the filing fee for evictions for their own expenses. It leads them to potentially resist anything that might reduce the amount of filings in housing court. And as we saw in New York, the filings are down quite a bit. So there is that problem. I doubt you will often see the courts admitting to that being the problem of why they're resisting. If that is the case, it will probably be expressed some other way. But we have actually seen that. I've actually seen that in the child support context. It's the same problem. The courts take a piece of the filing fee for child support contempt, and so they tend to resist holding fewer people in contempt because they want more of these court cases to happen. So it can be a real issue. I think that the really point to take away there is to know in your jurisdiction, does the court actually get a piece of evictions? Because that will help you predict where the court may come down on this issue and how to be strategic in thinking about that. There is also a question about Stout's ballpark cost figure. I would probably get in a lot of trouble with them if I tried to give an answer to that question, but I can tell you that initially Stout was doing the reports pro bono. That was a long time ago. They are in great demand right now, but they are doing their reports at a vastly reduced scale. It's not even worth telling you what they charge normally for their regular clients. But suffice it to say, Stout is highly motivated to do this work. They want to do these reports. They have definitely worked with jurisdictions to find a price point that works for the jurisdiction, and in some cases that means scaling back the report to do something that they can afford, the jurisdiction can afford. So if anyone's interested in that, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to facilitate that connection with them. And again, they're very much eager to do this work. So we hope that you do think about them for that. Some of the questions that Eileen has, these great questions about, the mechanics of how adequate legal representation is provided and when and how is eligibility determined. Those are the kinds of things that we really do hope to get into the weeds on in these subsequent calls. I think the point is taken that they should be in our slides as well, because they are good questions that need to be asked. We don't want just what representation, we want that representation to be excellent. That's extremely important. So how you accomplish that, how you build that into the model is really tricky. And I will also say that when you look at these bills, what you find is that there's some amount that's in the bill, and then there's often a much greater amount that's not in the bill, that's basically done by the implementing authority, whoever that is. It's very, very difficult to spell everything out in the bill. It just makes the process really, really difficult. So some of it, there's some structure in the bill, and then some of the parameters are done by regulation or other mechanisms after the right is being implemented, which again goes to how important it is who is implementing it and whether you have trust in them and believe that they're doing this, with the same intentions that you have in mind. And, in your work, you can have a lot of effect on who that is, in your negotiations about how this is. You can make your own proposal for here's how we want this to work in our city, and you can negotiate, with the city or whatever, the state, about how that's going to be done. But so far, all of the campaigns have included some structure for that in their bills. And generally speaking, that's what's actually happened, is what was proposed by the advocacy community in general. That's generally what's happened. I don't know, Pablo, if you have your own take on that from New York or elsewhere.
I mean, I definitely want to say it's something we actually did in the Bronx, some court observations and surveys to see if tenants knew that they had the right to counsel. And so we, surveyed folks, and we saw that about half of tenants didn't know that they had the right to counsel, that them appearing on their first date was the first time they were meeting their tenant attorney. And there's also the other underlying issue that folks, because of the culture of housing court in the Bronx for decades, right, it's primarily only landlord attorneys. Some tenants also had a hard time navigating and figuring out, is this my landlord's attorney, right? Because landlord attorneys are deceptive and pretend to be your friend and say like, I'll work out a deal with you, but with right to counsel, that changes. And so, a part of this, a part of the right to counsel model in New York City, and then the 5-year zip code phase-in plan was about, not only building the infrastructure for right to counsel and capacity, because to this day, right to counsel attorneys don't have a private room to meet with their clients, to meet with tenants. So that's been a long-standing fight. But part of the implementation is, outreach. Like, when do people know that they can claim this right? Because that's important, right? To us, it's not just about the eviction defense is super important, keeping people in their homes, but for people to know their rights, feel empowered, know that an attorney has their back. And that also, to us, translates to proactively for tenants to engage in organizing work in their buildings, right? Because the majority of time, it's not just that person being taken to court. They probably they might not know that their neighbors or other families in the same building are also being taken to court. And so we have a pretty cool tool, if y'all are interested, called the New York City Worst Evictors, and you'll see which landlords use evictions as a tool against tenants. But yeah, I think those points, John, around outreach, people knowing their right, claiming it, exercising their power, and then feeling like they're really meeting one-on-one with their attorneys, and that they are getting quality representation, and their voices being heard, and they're getting solutions, or they're able to make decisions for themselves.
I think we have one more question, which is, is there a requirement of reporting and outreach to include notices of eviction, non-renewals, even those not filed in court and just posted to the door, to include packets on your right to counsel and abuse against women? So I think the question is whether we're asking whether the right to counsel information is included in those things. Is the right to counsel information included when someone gets a notice of eviction or non-renewal notice, or so on? In other words, like before the court proceeding, before you get a summons, are people being notified of the right to counsel? That is a great question. That is one I think we want to hear from on the jurisdictions. I know that I think it's in Boulder, that their ballot initiative requires the landlord to notify the tenant of their right to counsel, I think at the time they serve the notice to quit. And it may even also say at the time of lease up, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But I'm pretty sure it's at the notice to quit stage. And I think it's really a good point that, that if you wait till the summons, it's really kind of late in the process for notifying people of their right to counsel. Notifying them, because for one thing, a lot of people leave as soon as they get the notice to quit because they are so convinced that they're just going to be evicted. So if they knew they had a right to counsel at that moment, they might stay and fight for their rights. I don't know what the practice in New York currently is, if there's anything to comment on that.
I'm sorry, John, can you repeat the question? I was dropping some info on the chat.
Yeah, no, that's fine. The question is, how are tenants getting notified in New York of the right to counsel before they receive an evictions filing in court? Like, for instance, when they get the notice to quit, do they get notified? Does New York require the notice that the landlord serves on the tenant to also tell them about their right to counsel?
Yes, currently, when the Office of Court Administration mails out the notice that an eviction case has been started, whether it's a non-payment or holdover, it is indicated on the court papers that eligible tenants will qualify for right to counsel.
I think his question was a little different. It was before the court proceeding starts, but when the landlord serves the notice on the tenant, just the notice to quit, which isn't a court document, at that point, does the landlord have to tell the tenant that they have a right to counsel? Is there some process that tells them before a court case is started that they have this right?
No, there isn't a requirement for landlords to inform tenants that they will get right to counsel.
And I think that's something, it's a great question. And I think that we are expecting to be hearing more about that. I think as the programs roll out and we start to hear about how the right to counsel interacts with actual tenants, getting the notice as early as possible in the process is going to become extremely important. And the notice and the timing is one of those things that really is very important to address in the bill itself. It's too important to sort of leave that to the later process that gets worked out by whoever's running this thing. And generally speaking, most of the bills have tried to lay out like exactly how the tenant comes to be notified, like what are the means by which they are notified. It's generally spelled out in the bills or legislation.
Yeah, and I just wanted to emphasize that speaks to the necessity of doing outreach. And that is why, in New York City, we were fighting for the city to fund tenant organizing, right? Because we're trusted organizations in the community. We're constantly doing outreach and door knocking, letting folks know about their rights. And they know to contact us as a resource. And yeah, it's with landlords, our experience isn't that they really follow the law. That's all our organizing fights. So to be honest, I don't really trust that even if the state requires landlords to serve tenants that notice and let them know that they have right to counsel, that it will always happen. Or some folks, because there's issues of delivery, they might claim they have done so, have served, let folks know they have the right, but might not have done so. And again, in the Bronx and many communities of color where evictions happen at a higher rate, there's also immigrant populations that might not speak the language. So, and then fundamentally, like the tenants we organize don't trust their landlords, right? They're already in an adversarial position where they aren't receiving basic things, might be being overcharged or harassed. So there's also that fundamental layer that, tenants don't really trust landlords to do the right thing.
There was actually one last question that was dropped, which was, can a right to counsel be established for evictions without having that right extended to all civil cases? Absolutely. In the legislative context, it's actually quite easy to do that. The bill will just specify where the right exists, and it will not address any other civil areas. The states, just as context, every state in the country already has a right to counsel in some limited civil areas. Often around family law, mental health, and that sort of thing. No state currently has a right in housing court, but a state could very much do that and just say it only applies to evictions. Where we get into a little bit of that question is like when we litigate this issue and the courts say, well, if we provide it here, how are we not going to provide it? You know, if we recognize a due process right to counsel in evictions, why are we not going to recognize it in domestic violence or immigration or whatever? And, you know, we have answers to those questions, but we do have to deal with that question much more of the time when we're litigating than when we're just, you know, trying to get a bill passed. I think in the interest of time, we're about 10 minutes after the hour. The questions have been really just spot on. And I think this really shows how much appetite there is for the subject, as the fact that you all are here today, of course, but I just would really encourage you to sign up for the subsequent sessions. We're going to be sending out another alert about the next one, which is just actually next week, the first one, which is Baltimore. So we'll send out a registration link for that again, but we encourage you to sign up for the subsequent ones. The people that are going to be speaking, the organizers and attorneys really can just get into these kinds of questions you're asking. They can give you the answers from their perspectives. And we really chose the cities that are just so different from each other. You know, New York was the first and the largest. San Francisco was done by ballot initiative. Baltimore was the most recent. Cleveland's is narrower than the other ones and was done without the presence of tenant organizing. So each city is really going to have a different perspective on all of the questions that we've talked about today that come up. So we would love to see you again. Anything else you'd like to add, Pablo? Is there anything else?
No, I think I covered it. Check out the toolkit. Feel free to reach out anytime. I really mean that. Always available to talk through the organizing campaign one-on-one. Love to share knowledge. And I'm looking forward to seeing all of you next Tuesday at 3 again and hear from Baltimore.
So thank you for attending. We will send out materials and the link to this recording after the call, and look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.